Okay, the main dashboard for CalCATS that we land on when we arrive is the time and activity dashboard. The top part shows the amount of time you've entered for this payroll period. Everything in CalCATS is oriented around these 2-week payroll periods. They generally start on a Sunday and go through a Saturday, but that's configurable county by county. So in the test system for the test county, which I'm using San Joaquin County as a test county, I'm set up for a Sunday through Saturday. You may set something up different in your production system. So across the top, I see a row that shows the expected time I have for every day in that payroll period. So you can see my default time setup is just 10 8-hour days for a 1080 work period. Again, those can be customized. So if you work 7.5-hour days, or you work a 980, first Friday off, second Friday off, whatever, your county can customize those to match your work schedule. And then below that, we'll have the amount of hours that I've actually entered. And they are color coded. So the ones that are in this red color indicate that I haven't entered enough time for the day. Green means I've entered just the right amount of time, and orange means I've entered some overtime, and I should make sure I've got that correct and assigned the right overtime codes. And then below that, we have the activity summary, which is, these are all the activities that I've done during this 2-week period. So if I've done some, in this case, you see I've already entered some pesticide regulatory activity or PUE work. But as you do weights and measures inspections or trapping work or pest exclusion work, you'll see those activities sum up and then provide your total hours for that 2-week period. So it's just a nice place to go to kind of get a quick thumbnail as to whether your time entry for the period is complete, or if you still got some stuff that you need to get caught up on before that data is ready to go. Without spending too much more time on here, I'm going to jump into the timesheet entry. So if you look across the top, we're going to kind of go in order of the main menu here: timesheets, then agriculture, then weights and measures, and then we're going to skip over a couple of things and go over to reports. Before I move on, though, I do want to just emphasize that CalCATS is highly configurable, and your production configuration will be a little different than what we see in the test system today. And that's okay. As time goes by, your county may make changes in your configuration. So the names of the projects that are on your timesheet, or the way you report overtime, those things, may change over time. This training doesn't really cover the configuration. That's something I deal with your county admins with in a one-on-one discussion. But just be aware of that if you're doing some work and you don't see the right species listed under vertebrates for pest eradication, or you don't see the right trap types on your trapping forms, rather than having to contact the help desk and have us fiddle with things, all of that is really self-service for your county to set up and maintain and modify your configuration as time goes by. Okay, so let's jump into the timesheet. When we talk about the data that goes into CalCATS, time is a big part of it, right? And there's a lot of things where time is the only component. If I take 8 hours of vacation time, the time is the only component that I report on that. I may have to provide a remark that says who approved it, but there's no other metadata that goes along with that vacation time. Compare that or contrast that with if I do nursery inspections. Right? If I spend 8 hours doing nursery inspections, well, the system is going to be expecting a lot more data about those nursery inspections. How many acres did I inspect? How many pests did I detect? Were materials held? So that's when I talk about that additional data, that's what I'm referring to as activity data. And that'll become important when we look at how we enter time for things that are activities, because you go to a different place in the system to enter activities than you do just your basic time. But let's look at the architecture of this screen. So the first thing we see is our payroll period control, and you'll see this in a bunch of different places. Whenever we're talking about summing things up, it's always going to be by payroll period. In this case, this is 2024 payroll period number 13. And I can move back and forth in time. So if I want to go look at what I did last payroll period, I can just click on this left arrow here. And I can keep clicking and look back in time at all the different payroll periods that have occurred already. I can also jump to future payroll periods. If I know I'm going to be taking vacation next payroll period, I can enter that now, even though that payroll period isn't current yet. If you're doing some forensics and you want to go back to, say, January of this year, because someone's got a question about some time that was entered, you can just type a date into this jump to box. So I can just say, give me January 15, right? And I'll hit enter, and it will go search for that, and it will find for me the time card that had January 15th on it. And it will jump me to that time card, and then I can review, okay, what did I enter on that particular date? So it's very easy to jump around and look at time for different time periods. And then there's a little note here that says enter T to jump to today's date. So if I just want to get back to today, I don't have to type in the date. I just type T and hit enter, and it will jump me back to the current payroll period. Over to the right of that, we've got a status. So you've seen CalPEATS, you know how Calico does statuses. So not surprisingly, we have in progress, in review, and approved. It is not a requirement in CalCATS that supervisors review and approve timesheets, but I highly recommend that you follow that protocol simply because it makes it easier, well, it makes it harder to accidentally change time on an old time card. And the reason you don't want to do that is because you may have generated reports and sent them into the state that's based on the data that was there when that report was run. If you go and you change it without some kind of process for updating that information, you're going to end up having some audit questions. If you go through a CDFA audit and they want to look at your original time data versus the reports that were submitted. So when you're done with your time card for the payroll period, you'll put it into in review status, and that will kick it up to your supervisor. And we'll take a look at the supervisor timesheet review feature, and they'll review it. And just as we do in CalPEATS, they'll either kick it back to you and put it in progress again and ask you to make some changes, or they'll approve it and move it into approved status. Either way, whether it's in review or approved, it'll be locked as far as making changes to it until it gets moved back into in progress status. Next to that are 3 report buttons, but I'm not going to run these yet until we have some data in our time card. But these are 3 different ways of exporting your time data to Excel to take a look at it. I'm also going to skip talking about the new activity button. That will come a little bit later in the presentation. So let's move on down to the next piece. This area here starts with mode activity tracking and has some areas that are lit up like enabled, and then areas like this edit area that are grayed out and disabled. This is the time card hints panel. And depending on what kind of time you're entering, different parts of this will light up or be disabled. And that gives you a hint as to how you enter time for that particular category on the time card. After you've done this for a while, it'll become second nature, but while you're getting used to it, it's really useful to have that as a reminder as to how you can enter time in the time card. Then below that, we have, the time card. Most time card systems are some variation of this. We have columns for all the days in the payroll period, and then we have rows for all the different time codes that you can bill time to. So things like vacation, holiday, comp time taken, and then things like crop statistics or cannabis. And we'll go through those different categories and what they look like. Just keep in mind that this isn't necessarily the list you'll see when you're in your production system. And that's where the timesheet hints area comes in handy. So it'll explain to you for every given category that you have on your timesheet, it'll tell you how to enter time for it. Okay, below that, we have, again, repeated from the dashboard, our expected hours. So that tells me how many hours I'm expected to enter every day, and then total, how many have I entered? So I can eyeball these 2 rows and see if my time card is complete and ready to go. And then finally below that, we have a summary of regular time versus overtime. And this is an expandable row. I can expand that, and it will show me all the different kinds of overtime codes that your county may have. So it's a summary of the timesheet. And that is actually what I call a sticky row. So if I have, if I need to scroll my timesheet up and down, this bottom part sort of sticks there. So it's always visible to you when you're working on your timesheet. Last thing we see on the screen is this row at the bottom, add timesheet row. In the configuration of your system, there may be a couple of dozen different possible time codes that you can build to. And some of them are things you will very rarely use, hopefully, like bereavement time or jury duty or COVID time off. And so you don't necessarily want your time card cluttered with those things every week or every 2 weeks because you rarely use them. So your administrator can create what we call timesheet templates, and different kinds of staff like clerical versus ag biologists versus weights and measures inspectors may have different templates that their time card uses. And those templates will define which of these project codes you see every time you do a timesheet. So if you're looking here and you say, oh, I got some jury duty this payroll period, I don't have a row for jury duty, you'll come down here to this drop down and you'll find those additional categories down here. So if it's not part of your normal timesheet template, you can just select it and then click add timesheet row and it will add it to the timesheet for that payroll period. Now, before we move into actually entering time here, I just want to emphasize, the real benefit of CalCATS is at the end of every month, every quarter, every year, generating reports to CDFA, whether they're your CMR reports or the annual financial statement. The feedback that we're getting from CalCATS counties is that reporting is a snap. It's super easy to do and it's great as long as all the time that the staff is entering is entered in the correct categories. So a big part of how we've laid out CalCATS is to try and give you as many different mechanisms as possible for ensuring your time's going into the right buckets. So when I say things like, hey, if you don't see a time category for something you're trying to enter, instead of sticking it in some other category because it's convenient to put it there, make sure you're picking the right category for your time. And then if you are a supervisor and you have people reporting to you, you'll use that supervisor time card review function a lot to make sure people have their time in the right spots. The advantage of putting that effort into your time cards is that, like I say, at the end of the reporting periods, you hit a button, the report comes out, and you send it in and you're done. So it is an enormous time saver from that perspective. Okay, so let's jump into the time card itself. I'm going to click on Monday, June 17th, and you'll see that the cell gets highlighted that I'm working in. And just a quick note, I won't mention this over and over again, but the time card is very keyboard friendly. So in all of the hint areas, you'll see, buttons. Right now it says to move, use the arrow keys or the tab keys and so on. So yeah, I'm much more a keyboard person than a mouse person. So I can just use my keyboard to navigate around like I'm in an Excel document. I don't have to necessarily reach for the mouse to do everything I need to do. So let's go to a nice simple row, right? Ag training. What is ag training? Well, it's a category I made up to track ag training time that's not billable to any given program, right? So it's just kind of indirect ag time spent on training programs. You'll see in the hint area, it says modes, simple entry. There's 3 different modes of entry on the time card. Simple entry, straight entry, and custom entry. There is a 4th that we'll see, which is activity entry, but that one is one that you don't actually enter on the time card, so I'll address that one last. Let's take a look at another category like vacation. So if I arrow down to vacation, you'll see the mode says straight entry. And if you were keeping your eye on it, you'll see that different parts of the time card hint panel have lit up. So let's talk about this one. Straight entry, how do I enter time for straight entry? Well, right next to the mode and the movement keys is how do I edit time? So it's right now says in order to edit, either start typing or hit Control Enter. So I could just type a number, 8. And then you'll see what's lit up is save. And to save it, I hit the Enter key or the Tab key. So I'll just hit Enter. And now you'll see I've got 8 hours recorded under vacation on my time card. That's it. Nice and simple. If you've been through training with me before, which I'm sure many of you have on the various systems that you have, you know I always emphasize if there's a save button on the screen, make sure you click it. And if there's no save button on the screen, that means you don't have to. So there's no save button anywhere here. And the time data that you enter on the time card are saved automatically behind the scenes whenever you execute that save command, whether it's the enter key or the tab key. So again, I can go over to the next day, I can put in 8 hours, hit enter, and now that's saved to the database for me. The only other area that's lit up is the area up in the time card hint panel that says remarks. And for that, it says I can press the R key or I can double click the left mouse button. So I'll just hit the R key and you'll see it pops up a little window for remarks. So for vacation, I might have to say, well, you know, who is this approved by? Okay, so that's nice and simple. And then here I do actually have to reach for the mouse and click the save button. Now, as a supervisor reviewing this time card, I'll see this helpful little green icon in the corner of that cell. That means that there's a remark entered there. So if I just want to make sure that an employee has entered remarks for all of their vacation time, I can quickly eyeball that and see where the remarks are entered, and in this case, where they're not. Okay, if I want to delete time, I can just click into that cell and hit delete key, then again, enter a tab, and that will save that deletion to the database. So that's it for straight entry. Straight entry is the simplest, and it means you just straight up enter the time directly on the time card. Now let's go up to the next category, which is simple entry. And for that one, I'll pick ag training. So let me go up to ag training. And you'll see here the edit panel is dimmed out. So I can't just edit by typing, right? So not going to let me type time directly in there. Instead, it says for details, click Control Enter or double click. So let me double click in that cell and see what it's asking for. So in this case, there is a very simple form I need to fill out whenever I put time on this category. So for ag trading, it wants to know what's the program, and there is only one, so it's pre-selected it for me, agriculture. But then it also wants to know the subprogram. So what kind of training was I doing? I was doing pest exclusion training. And now it says I want to know hours, 3.5. I want to know mileage, 12.5 miles, expenses, you know, did I have reimbursable expenses from this training session? And then remarks. So this could be, you know, I don't even know if there is a UC Humboldt. But wherever you're entering time, there is always an opportunity to put remarks in. That's one of the key features of time tracking, is to always have a place to explain the time you've entered. And now I can click the little checkbox and that will enter that time. And you'll notice that I'm still not done with the form, right? Because for things like ag training, maybe I did more than one in a given day. So maybe we did some pest exclusion training, and then I did another half hour of pest management training. Okay, so I've got a total of 4 hours entered in ag training for that day. And again, this is simple entry. That means that there is some additional data I need to provide, but it's very simple. So I can just pop up the form right on top of the time card. Now let's talk about some of the other icons we see here. You're always going to see a trash can icon. That's pretty self-evident. That means I delete a record. So I can click on that and it'll ask me to confirm. You'll always get a polite confirmation box when you try and delete some data. Say yes, and that row will be deleted. And you'll see my time is automatically updated on the time card back to my 3.5 hours. You also may see this icon, this clock icon. And up here it says, you know, the clock icon is for allocating time codes. So when would I use the clock icon? Let's say I put in, instead of 3.5 hours, I put in 9.5 hours. So it was a really long training session. Well, somewhere in here, actually, I'll do a slightly different example. I'll put 6 hours, and then on my pest management, I'll put another 4 hours. So somewhere in here, I've got some overtime, right? I can't spend 10 hours in a day and not record some overtime. Now, if your county requires you to pick a specific overtime code, then you use the clock icon to determine which of these hours is actually going to be assigned to overtime. So I decide that, 6 hours and 2 hours of pest management were a regular time and 2 hours of this pest management training was overtime. I'll go into this row and click on the clock, and I'll take that 4 hours and I'll split it to 2 hours of regular time and 1 hour or 2 hours of regular overtime. Okay, and I'll get a little blue icon in the top left of the cell, and same on the time card itself, showing me that there's overtime in that cell and it's been allocated to an overtime code. Now, I haven't had this discussion with Waylon yet. I'm not sure if you have different overtime codes. If your county only has one overtime code, in other words, you just count everything over 8 hours or everything over your expected number of hours as overtime, then you don't need to do that step. But most counties have at least 2 or 3 different kind of overtime codes that you have to use, in which case you'll see that clock icon that lets you assign that overtime to, one of the codes that's appropriate for that day's activities. So that's 2 of our data entry types. There's straight entry, which is just you straight up enter it onto the timesheet. Simple entry, where you double click in the cell or control click in it, and you get a simple form to fill out with some additional detail on your time. The third kind is custom entry, and you may or may not have any custom entry to do. When you first start, you won't have any custom entry to do. But as I mentioned in the intro to the session, CalCATS is very, very configurable. And who knows what CDFA is going to throw at us, next year. Maybe next year you'll have some little contract to go after spotted lanternflies, and it, is done in some different way where you have to track data that doesn't exist on any of the CMR forms. In that case, your county can create what's called a custom form. And this special projects row is just an example of a custom form. So if I go in there, it says mode custom tracking. And again, for details, it says to control enter or double click. So let me double click in here. And now you'll see not necessarily a simple form, but a custom form. Right? In this case, it wants to know the program. It wants to know a subprogram. It wants to know a contract. It wants to know various other things. Classes. What is class? Well, class is a user-defined field with a drop-down list. In this case, it has no particular meaning at all. Dollar value is a user-defined field that's expecting a number. So if I try and type letters in there, it won't let me, but I can put in $25. So all of these are user-defined fields that, as an administrator, I went in and created for the special purpose of tracking this particular time. Okay, so like I said, you won't have any of these when you first start out, but down the road, you may well experience a row that says it's custom tracking. Just be aware that very much like simple tracking, the screen will tell you have to control enter or double click to enter your time. And then the form that pops up will tell you all the information you have to provide in addition to your hours. Okay, so let's put in a couple of other time entries here, and let's pop one in over here on Monday. So before I go looking at the reports, I'm just trying to fill in some cells here, so we'll have some data for our reports. But this is a good time to talk about these terms, direct and indirect. I'm sure you're all familiar with the terms. I mean, it's nothing new to your activity tracking. And that is time that doesn't go in on a specific CMR form or on a specific weights and measures inspection or a specific PUE activity is either going to be considered direct time, where it's going to get billed to a very specific program, or it's indirect time, like, moving offices or doing filing work, where it doesn't get billed, and in fact, it gets allocated across a bunch of different programs. So let's have a look at professional support indirect, right? In this case, you'll see it's straight entry. So if I put in 4 hours here, That's indirect time. That means that 4 hours is going to get spread across all the different programs that the county operates in. Conversely, if I put time in professional support direct, that simple entry, that means I double click on it and I get a form that says, okay, let's direct. Where's it going? Well, this is specifically to pest exclusion. So that 4 hours is not going to be allocated. It's going to be billed directly to pest exclusion. Okay, so let's take a look at the outputs I can get from this time. The first is the timesheet report. So if I export that, this is going to give me an Excel file. And we try to do most of our exports to Excel because we find that to be the most useful file format for working with data. And well, two things, and I shouldn't have clicked that just yet, but whenever you open an Excel file from the internet, Microsoft now, in an effort to protect you from yourself, disables editing, and you have to click that yellow banner that pops up that says enable editing. You will find that there's a lot of reports in CalCATS, and let me reopen this so you can see what I'm talking about. If I go to the timesheet tab in this report, the data doesn't show up correctly until I click this enable editing, and then it fills in properly. Reason for that is that Excel won't compute any formulas that are in the spreadsheet until you click on enable editing. So just remember, whenever you grab an export from CalCATS, always click on the enable editing. Now, every time you export from CalCATS to Excel, you're going to get a first tab here. It's called export info, and it's going to tell you what is the export, who exported it, when they exported it, which user it was exported for, in other words, who the data belongs to, not who ran the report. And then this section here will list any filters that were applied to that report when it was run. So, you're going to find there's a plethora of reports in CalCATS, and you're probably going to use a lot of them. And sometimes it gets hard to track what's in a given file. So we always include that cover sheet that tells you what the data, when it was generated, and what the filters were that generated it. The second tab here we see is the actual timesheet data. And it's set up to print a header section here that covers a summary report for the 2-week period. It has a spot if you wanted to print these out as your official time cards and sign them. It has a spot for the employee and the supervisor to sign. There's a row here that we can fill with a custom statement if you have a particular statement that your employees need to agree to on their time cards. And then below that, you have week 1 and all the time, and week 2 and all the time. So nothing really too special. It's formatted to print out nicely. Week 1 prints on the first page and week 2 prints on the second page. So a lot of counties have a separate payroll system where this time has to be entered and signed. And so they don't necessarily use this printable form, but if you wanted to, it's available as the timesheet export button. The second one I'll look at is actually, I'll skip over to here to the export payroll report. As I mentioned, a lot of counties require you, after you filled out your detailed time card, to go and fill out your HR, your payroll time card. And payroll systems generally don't have all of these projects in them because they don't care about this. What they care about is your work time and then all the different categories of leave time. So in CalCATS, we have a mapping system that lets you map your project names as they show up in your CalCATS system versus how they show up in your payroll system. And let me show you an example. If I export this payroll report, initially it looks a lot like the timesheet report. But if we look a little closer, you'll see that the project names have been compressed into vacation, regular work time, and overtime. So we can set this up so that it makes it easier for you to then transcribe these numbers into your payroll system without having to, add things up and roll things up in between the two systems. So that's our second timesheet export. And then the third one those timesheets look nice and they print out nicely, but it's not really very useful for doing any data analysis because it's not a tabular report. So the third export we have on the time card is a tabular report. That's called the time audit report. And that one, if I look at the data tab, you'll see is more like a data dump. So I have columns for date, employee, the timesheet category name, the program and subprogram it was billed to, a whole bunch of other fields that will get filled out as we enter different kinds of activities. And then finally, the time, the hours, the miles, the expenses, and the remarks. Now, this is useful when you're just, validating your own timesheet, but this audit report can also be run for multiple employees and for any date range that you like. And it is probably the most used report in CalCATS in production today.